So to begin, hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Vladimir. I'm the Deputy Editor of the Geopolitical Review and a third year at Balliol College, Oxford. We're all here to discuss the recent devastating Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has been weighing heavily on everyone's minds, so as to shed some light on these developments. It seems as though there's little agreement on what's going on, what the responses or the outcome will be. We now have 1 million Ukrainian citizens fleeing the country and infrastructure is being razed to the ground. So the humanitarian impact is escalating rapidly. As the conflict develops and more people become displaced, we'd like to urge everyone to consider supporting the people of Ukraine in any way you can. We have linked resources on the OPR event page for the panel on the Facebook, and we'll also be sending them in on the group chat, on the Zoom chat, if that's possible. I would now like to go on to introduce our amazing panelists. From the University of Oxford, we have International Relations Professor Neil MacFarlane, who's a specialist in Russian foreign and security policy and has written extensively on these topics. Welcome, Professor MacFarlane.
Thank you.
We're also meant to be having the Professor of European Studies, Timothy Garton, who hopefully will be joining us soon, but it feels a bit odd to introduce him in his absence. So moving on, from the University of Toronto, we have political science professor Seva Gunitsky, who also contributes to publications such as Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, we have Orysia Lutsevych, manager of the Ukraine Forum in Russian Eurasia program at Chatham House and a prominent policy institute based in London. Thank you so much, Ms. Lutsevych. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. We understand you must all be incredibly busy and your commentary on these unfolding events have been invaluable. So just to start off the discussion, I'd like to start off with a question on what's currently happening. We have read accounts of ordinary Ukrainian citizens taking up arms, vigilante justice against looters on the ground, the use of apps to track the movement of Russian troops. In light of this frantic effort to respond to a rapidly moving and disproportionately more powerful threat, what is the situation looking like for Ukraine right now? And maybe could Ms. Lutsevych potentially start us off on this question?
Thank you very much for having me, Fiona. I think actually there's quite a lot of agreement what is going on. So just to pick up on your sentence that there's little agreement what is going on. There's been an act of aggression on Ukrainian territory that is different from what happened in 2014 because Russia for the first time clearly said it is invading Ukraine to decapitate its leadership, to take up on its territory and to reconstitute a Ukrainian state in what they believe would be some kind of a federal constellation of regions, depending on the territory they managed to conquer. Putin used a very disturbing rhetoric to describe his plan about Ukraine. The infamous article that was first published on RIA Novosti, then taken off, speaks about the solving of Ukraine question. So think carefully what this means and his term of denazification of Ukraine. I mean, honestly, Ukraine is led by the Russian-speaking Jewish president. So I honestly don't know what Putin has in his mind other than the war of terror and attrition that is being unleashed on Ukraine. The Secretary General Stoltenberg said, the coming days of war are likely to be worse. Today, this is his exact quote, President Macron, after his telephone conversation with Putin, said exactly the same. Jan Psaki said Putin is trying to take Kyiv and all of Ukraine. Putin's plan is failing. He wanted to have a kind of sandstorm operation where this is all completed in 100 hours, but it did not. And right now what we see is civilians are no longer collateral damage of Putin's bombs, but actually targeted missiles are being struck at this critical infrastructure of power plants, some hospitals and electricity grids. So we already seeing crimes, war crimes being performed where there's no safe passage for civilians to leave large Ukrainian cities such as Mariupol, such as Kharkiv, and soon Kyiv. Soon Odessa. So we see the takeover of nuclear power plants with no statement that these power plants, such as Zaporizhia, that is the 10th largest in the world with 6 nuclear reactors, is being taken and fire was raging there this morning. So we are seeing basically 480 missiles shot on Ukrainian territory, 70 of them shot from the territory of Belarus. So we are heading into a big war. I'll stop here just to give you an idea of what is going on, and now we can have a discussion.
All right, does anybody else have anything to add on to what Ms. Lutsevych has already told us?
Yeah, if I may. I agree with Orysia. The question is, what is the trajectory? And it seems to me Putin believed that he could take Ukraine easily. He deployed less than a third of his combined force in the initial stage because he figured it would fall. He completely miscalculated Ukrainian resistance. He also miscalculated Western resistance. He also miscalculated the capacity of his own armed forces. So he's in a bit of a mess now. And I think the answer for him, I'm sorry to say, is essentially to do what it takes to take down Kyiv and to effectively replace the government. That is not the end, although he may think it is the end. It is not the end. That is the beginning of a very long and difficult struggle for Russia. The analogy that comes to my mind here is Afghanistan.
So I'll pick up on that, if that's okay with you, Foni, on the over-optimism particularly. So Russia sustained 6,000 casualties, I think is the last count, probably more now, which is a shocking number, just to give you a sense of the military context in which Russia is operating in Ukraine. Much higher casualties than any other wars under Putin. More than Americans lost in Iraq the whole time. Even Afghanistan, which Neil mentioned, the USSR lost about 15,000 people in 10 years. So to lose 6,000 people in a week is absolutely shocking. And partly this is poor planning and over-optimism. And partly it's the soldiers don't want to be there. At least it seems to be the case. I mean, just imagine for one moment that you're a Russian conscript and you're trudging through the Chernobyl exclusion zone to capture a town where parts of your family used to live. What is your morale going to look like? Not great. So under these conditions, the situation is going to deteriorate. Putin's war aims, as far as we can see, are maximalist. That is, he seems to be aiming for destruction of independent Ukraine. And he's resorting to large-scale attacks, including on civilians, to essentially force the country into submission. And it's very hard to tell what this actually means for any endgame, potentially occupying the eastern half and establishing a puppet state. It's not really clear, and the situation is too fluid, but I agree with Orysia that he will have to escalate and double down. He's being squeezed from the outside, of course, but more directly for him, he's vulnerable to being overthrown if he shows weakness. And it's actually hard to believe for me that I'm even talking about the possibility of a coup, which 2 weeks ago I would have said is zero, now still very, very small, but not zero. So it's hard to see how the West can get him to de-escalate without looking weak, which he can't do. And for that reason, it's hard to see things getting better in Ukraine. So unless Putin reverses course or is removed, I'm afraid it means, as Macron's office and others have said, for Ukraine, the worst is yet to come.
Welcome, Professor Garton. Thank you for joining us. I'm just gonna take this discussion, and then you've all made like potentially some comments touching upon this and a bit on Putin as a character. So I'd like to potentially direct this conversation towards what Putin's motivations in doing so might be. I think it's worth contextualizing here that we've gotten a lot of character profiles about him in the media, which will either discuss his revanchist aims as stemming from personal ambitions, his aim to restore the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, or painting him as a paranoid autocrat trying to preserve his own power. But there's also an element of the media which gives more credence to Russia's claims about this being a strategic issue or a response to a security concern, which has escalated after failed demands and negotiations with NATO. So I was just wondering whether there's anything to these narratives or whether it's something else entirely, and also how much stock can we put into the agency of a single individual? I'd like to invite Professor MacFarlane to potentially begin this discussion.
I'll be brief, Foni. I think in a macro sense, what he wants is a basic adjustment of the European security regime, moving Russia back into a position of equality as a great power. That involves no more eastward NATO expansion. And it, as he has said, this involves the withdrawal of NATO forces to pre-1997 lines. All of that is not attainable. With regard to Ukraine, he has said, I think, or his colleagues have said, that they want neutralization, demilitarization, and sub rosa, a replacement of the government. I expect that there's also another bit to this, moving down the spectrum. I think he probably wants change in boundaries. So in particular, the land corridor to Crimea from Russia, and the restoration of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts to their previous boundaries under Russian control. Leaving aside the specifics, I think at the end of it, I take him seriously when he said in July that Ukraine is a fiction because Ukrainians and Russians are one people. I think he has a sort of mystical aspect here. The problem is that the Ukrainians don't agree. And so here we are.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add to that? Yeah, Professor Garton Ash.
So first of all, I'm awfully sorry to be late in joining. It was directly connected with Ukraine. I was just talking to someone very well connected in Moscow, and I'm afraid the prognosis is really grim. He told me he'd just talked to someone senior in the Russian military. They think they're still going to win simply by escalating, more bombardment, more besieging, and just take the casualties. So it looks very grim indeed. Just quickly on the Putin point, I mean, I do think if anyone doubted the role of the individual in history, this proves them wrong, because it is so much about Vladimir Putin. And I think, as Neil just said, three elements, and you can weight the elements differently. Element number one, he's a Ukraine denier. The Ukrainians think they're a real country and it's their country. He thinks it's not a real country and it's not theirs. It's part of Russia. I mean, he said that so many times, we have to believe him. Secondly, the threat of democracy in Ukraine. Remember, if you look at the chronology of the Putin regime's response altogether, the Orange Revolution 2004-5 is a crucial moment in the response, and then Euromaidan in 2014. So that's a distinct factor, a Ukrainian democracy that might look attractive to his own people. And then, as Neil said, of course, the security point, the points about NATO enlargement and so on. So I think those are the three big factors, and one can then argue about how exactly we weight them or interrelate them.
If I may just say a couple of words. I think that Putin is after dismantling of what is left of the world order. He is not just about Ukraine. For him, Ukraine is just one step towards this effort. And I think Neil also hinted onto that, right? I know of people from Lithuania, leaving Lithuania to France because they fear the spillover effect of this. Ukraine is right now shielding this as much as it can, heroically, where, you know, Ukrainian armed forces are now synonym of courage, taking up on this, you know, it's a David and Goliath fight, right? This is what the whole world is watching with the consequences on civilian populations. And nobody, if Kyiv falls, nobody will be safe within the range of Russian missiles, nobody. This is first, I think, important. And Neil, again, you mentioned Belarus. Belarus doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if any diplomatic effort or whatever behind the scene effort can be done to dissuade Lukashenko to send his boys to sheer death in Belarus. Yes, of course, Russians fly military jets and they shoot missiles from Belarus, but they haven't yet sent, you know, massive deployment on land into Ukraine. If that is not possible to stop, there's no Belarus. There will be nuclear weapons stationed there, threatening directly NATO territory. So I think Putin, and I think here's a question to all of us, whether we are ready to really work towards a midterm strategy, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, to really cripple Putin regime? Or are we still looking for off-ramps? Are we still looking for, do we still believe for some kind of midway solution? In Ukraine, and I tell you what I hear from people fighting, from people mobilized into territorial defense, they say if Russia stops fighting, there is no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there is no Ukraine. I think this encapsulates the feeling of it. The question is whether Ukraine will be left alone to this, or there will be an anti-Russian coalition to cripple Putin and defend Ukraine.
Could I just jump in there to say one?
Sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, forgive me. Go ahead.
Well, if you wanted to follow up on the Russia's comment directly, maybe you should do that first.
Could I just literally 2 sentences on the crippling response to Putin? Of course, a key point in that would be a total SWIFT ban affecting Gazprom Bank. Then the lights start going out in Dusseldorf and Munich and Rome and Milan. And so our energy dependency means that Europe has one arm tied behind its back on this. There are politicians in Europe who are pressing for this. Norbert Röttgen, the former chair of the Bundestag Foreign Affairs Committee, is pressing very strongly for this. But I don't think that Germany or Italy are going to go for it. And without that, Russia is still getting roughly €500 million, I think it is, euros a day in payments for gas and oil.
Let me just add one more thing, because I think we've covered pretty much all of it. I think we have to be very, very careful about talking about what Putin really wants, because everybody claims to know what Putin really wants, and they've been claiming it for years, and time again, it turns out they were wrong. I think many experts, including myself, have been used to treating Putin as a pragmatic actor. And that's no longer the case, I think, clearly. If not rational, at least pragmatic. And that's not to say he's necessarily irrational, but whatever cost-benefit calculation he has is not one that most people, including Russian observers, by the way, can understand or identify with. And that's because the act does suggest a certain detachment from reality, setting aside the sheer criminality of it. You know, this practically already has guaranteed all the things Putin supposedly did not want: a stronger NATO, an anti-Russian Ukraine, isolated Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, for me, the real puzzle is, how did we get here? And for 20 years, Putin has based the foundation of his legitimacy on one premise. And that's, at least I saved you from the 90s. Even his detractors, even his skeptics gave him that. At least he saved us from the 90s, that awful, volatile period. And now the foundation of that legitimacy is collapsing completely. It already looks like it's going to be a needless disaster. So we can't really get into Putin's head, but we can think about his immediate decision-making environment, who he interacts with, who he takes advice from. And, you know, Russia is a personalist regime. That means it's an autocratic system in which power is concentrated in a single individual, rather than a ruling party like, say, under Brezhnev, or a military elite. And personalist regimes have certain pathologies that we see over and over again, that we are seeing here as well. Personalist leaders face few restraints on what they do. We see that here. They choose their circle of advisors, not necessarily based on competence, but on who will agree with them. So they're surrounded by weak people. And we certainly saw some of that in Putin's struggle session with his advisors last week. They suffer huge information problems, these kinds of regimes, because those same weak underlings feed them bad, limited, biased information. And we have definitely seen a lot of that, over-optimism and miscalculation. And by the way, these tendencies get worse over time. Putin has been in power for 20 years. The inner circles of these personalist rulers tend to narrow and consolidate around the security services, because that's who keeps you in power. And those people are already prone to aggression. They're already prone to see enemies everywhere. Not to mention the ruler becomes more optimistic over time. And we certainly have seen that with Putin, where after 2012 especially, he seems to have grown very confident in his abilities. And to all that, we need to add another factor, which is COVID. Putin has become completely isolated from all but a few trusted associates. Every image, even before this conflict started, every image of him for the last few months shows a life of self-imposed isolation, which is very unsettling for a leader who's engaging in this legacy-defining crisis escalation. And his inner circle is now all Siloviki, loyalist, hawkish security services. So when we talk about his motivations, all of that has to be accounted. The poor decision-making and the repeated miscalculations, I think, do stem from some of these institutionalist pathologies, which were intensified by COVID. And just to Timothy's point, it's true from a Russian national interest perspective that an invasion makes zero sense. But of course, the thing about history is that it makes zero sense, and we have to live with that. We like structural explanations in social science. We like recurring mechanisms and patterns. I'm speaking now as an academic, not as a human person. But in the case of here, the case really does seem to come down not to any national interest, but the motivations of one particular individual, which makes things incredibly hard. But that's where we are.
Thank you so much. I want to bring back, because we touched upon that, I want to bring back the conversation a bit to a two-pronged question with regards to the response of the West. And I wanted to ask, just kind of in a more structured discussion, have sanctions been effective so far, or will they soon be pressured, and will they be willing to send in like further support on the ground? And the second aspect of this question would be referring to a lot of the responsibility that has been put onto the West potentially for the situation we're in now. So a lot of commentators have either suggested that the West has been too accommodating or not taking Russia's concerns and actions seriously enough, or for NATO being too provocative. And I was wondering what you felt their responsibility was in this situation, and how you think they're going to respond in the future. Could I bring this back to Professor MacFarlane?
Oh, thank you so much, Fonny. In terms of responsibility, I think the record speaks for itself. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. We didn't even bother to discuss sanctions. In 2014, Russia effectively invaded eastern Ukraine, and the EU put on modest sanctions that would have no lingering effect. And so, I mean, I'm no apologist for Vladimir Putin, but we may have trained him into this. He figures, well, they didn't do anything the last two times, so let's try another one. And that's what his miscalculation was. We learn too. And that gets me to the issue of sanctions and are they working? Well, depends on what you mean by working. Clearly, there has been a substantial depreciation in the value of the ruble and a substantial and growing increase in inflation. The problem with those, I guess, to me, is that who bears the pain there? It's the people of Russia who bear the pain. I think that the elite is pretty insulated from this, and this is why SWIFT is so important, and also sanctions on Russians with bank accounts, particularly in London. How it will go, I don't know. One thing I do know, and at least in as much as I know anything, we are not going to intervene on the ground or in the air because of the fear of nuclear escalation.
Can I add a bit, or sorry, am I interrupting anybody? On the West, so this is the small silver lining of this whole thing, something that not a lot of people necessarily expected. And Putin, always talked about wanting a more multipolar world. He's been talking about it for years, and now he's kind of getting it with the EU becoming a major global actor. He's not getting it the way he wanted it, but he's getting it. So maybe he's a strategic genius. I don't know. I do want to say, just maybe it's my Soviet cynicism. It looks amazing now, the Western effort, but the reawakened messianism of Western foreign policy could end up recreating some of the worst tendencies of the first Cold War. And already we see some calls to escalate against Russia, including, including nuclear strikes, I mean, that's from crazy people, but you see all kinds of calls to escalate. But even from the national security establishment, you see it on Twitter over the past few days, think tankers, big journalists, the same people who were wondering last week, why is Putin being so irrational, are now just kind of spitballing nuclear escalation scenarios. Let's do it. What's he really going to do about it? And I think we have to be much more cautious about it. This is part of sort of normal war fever, but people are being way too cavalier about the escalatory intentions of a guy like Putin, who's cornered. There's this idea in security studies, the stability-instability paradox, which argues, look, you can escalate you can have low-level escalation between great powers, and that's okay because nuclear escalation is unthinkable. That's why you got all those proxy wars in the first Cold War. But I think that last bit, the unthinkable bit, really needs to be re-examined right now. I think people calling for a no-fly zone should be honest and say explicitly that they're willing to risk nuclear war and tell us just how much of a risk they're willing to take. And by the way, people calling for backing off should explicitly say that they're willing to tolerate war crimes, which are likely to keep happening. So there's no moral ground here, moral high ground for anybody here. I'm sorry. All I hope is that the conflict ends as a result of this pressure.
Before we move on, I just wanted to potentially ask, how likely do we think, what would it take for us to reach this nuclear option? Because I feel like, you get a lot of people split between whether, we would actually ever, reach the point where this would be a thinkable option or not. Just to piggyback off of what you've said.
Well, I personally have no idea. All I know is when we calculate expected utilities, even when the risk is tiny and the outcome is potentially huge, we have to take that into account.
Professor Garton.
3 quick comments. First of all, Neil is absolutely right. 2014 is the turning point at which the West failed to turn. You're right. Georgia, 2008, we should have had a stronger reaction. Fiona Hill has written very well about this, but it's really 2014. If you imagine that the West at that point had started reducing its energy dependence on Russia, imposed really significant sanctions, done more to build up the military defense capacity of Ukraine, all the things we're sort of scrambling to do now, we would, I think, be arguably in a different place. Certainly the deterrence would have been much more credible. Point number 2, we have a lot of history of sanctions. They never work overnight or in a matter of weeks. They're not going to stop Putin's aggression. It's a matter of years, not days or weeks. So let's just be clear about that. And it's a matter of them being maintained. Because, by the way, I saw Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya the other day. They are pointing out that the sanctions on Belarus now have massive loopholes in them. Belarus is actually sanctioned. Third point, on the West, I actually disagree with Seva. I think there's a very, very small risk of that ever coming from the West, because what you're hearing from the West is we're going to stand strong in the defense of NATO and the EU. That's what you hear from Biden and Macron and Scholz. They have no answer for what we're actually going to do for Ukraine or Belarus or Georgia. It's all about the defense of the existing West. So I think a new Cold War is possible with a new Iron Curtain down the eastern frontier of NATO or the EU. It's a real, and that gives nothing for Ukraine. So I hope Ukraine.
I mean, just add a few ideas. I think it's very clear now to understand that sanctions before war and sanctions after war, 2 different creatures. Sanctions before war were very mild. Honestly, after the annexation of Crimea, almost non-existent on Russia. Only after downing of MH17 that escalated. Now, the sanctions have the purpose of crippling Putin, shutting down Russian economy, basically regime change. This is my interpretation of sanctions. These sanctions have already quite devastating impact on the economy, because if you take the London Stock Exchange, where Russian companies are listed, more or less as a measure of what it means, they plummeted 98%. And I think we see Russians fleeing the country as well, because they understand there's no future in this country. And I think that from the private sector to states, the sanctions on the Russian central bank are huge. Honestly, I think it's a more nuclear option than SWIFT that we were talking about, because at that time it was unthinkable to imagine that there could be sanctions on the Russian central bank and in a way freezing assets of roughly 400 billion that Russia holds in US dollars and euro. But what more could be done? And there are. Why is there 30 days grace period in the introduction of US sanctions? I don't understand. Putin is not giving grace period for Ukrainian civilians to leave their cities. The bombing started now. I think that the question is, if we are so cautious about our electricity grid, and I understand, why not carpet sanction 100 oligarchs? Why are we so shy? We know that a lot of this is illicit finance. Even without war in Ukraine, they should not have had a safe haven. But now on Ukraine, because I think it's very important, how do we help Ukraine without escalating? And look, Ukrainians are asking for air defense and jets, fighter jets. I don't know exactly what was discussed today at NATO, but this is the position of Kyiv. They are asking for Lend-Lease line to procure the necessary armaments, like it was during the Second World War, that US had open line for UK to defend Europe. Ukrainians are desperate to get humanitarian corridors for their civilians. It will be very disturbing what we will be reading and seeing in the news. And honestly, we know the kind of war Russians are fighting. And finally, something that we had a quick chat with Neil before we started the event. Today at Chatham House, something quite significant happened, where there is a declaration for establishing a special tribunal, as it's called, calling for the creation of a special tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And I have posted this declaration in the chat, so you can find it in the stream. And I will tell you, we will never have peace in Europe. And here we are thinking strategically, not just in immediacy, until the crimes of Stalin regime and Putin regime are condemned and prosecuted. And I think this is the cause of permanent insecurity that we live in. And this is exactly the cause of that problems in the security architecture that Putin wanted to discuss. These crimes are the cause of that insecurity. And I think we have to remember this. Thank you.
Okay. I also just wanted to ask, while we have you on the spot, or if anyone else wants to jump in at this point, I was wondering, because this got mentioned before, and a big issue, and what got mentioned before was the fact that sanctions, who they're hitting, are regular, Russian people the most. And I wanted to ask a bit about the influence of internal opinion and backlash, domestic opinion and backlash within Russia. What are the Russian people thinking right now? How successful is Putin's propaganda? What exactly is he peddling to these people? And if they're dying for a cause that they don't really believe in, could this be an effective way to kind of slow down the progress of the conflict in some capacity? So
I'll have a go at that if you want. First of all, in terms of Russian public opinion, it's actually very difficult to assess it, because you have a serious suppression of protest. So you have modest numbers. That means that probably for every protester, there are 100 people who in normal circumstances might want to go out there, but are afraid or intimidated. The second thing I would say is that this is a moving target in terms of Russian public opinion. Last week, they may have felt one way. After a couple of weeks of sanctions, and not being able to get money out of the bank, they may feel another way. So I think this is a very open question. I was at another panel early this afternoon where it was in the sociology department, and they were talking about protest movements. And one thing that struck me in that context was, I think it was Federico Varese saying, you know, protest movements bubble along and then they have a sudden wave going forward. So it may be that at some stage people in Moscow and Petersburg, etc., will just get sufficiently annoyed or oppressed by what is going on that they might fight back.
I'll just add that I don't have data, and I don't think anybody does, but I can tell you what my family is saying in Russia, what my friends are saying in Russia. Actually, I can't because this is polite company. I'm not supposed to say bad words, but they are not happy with Putin. And I think that reflects the opinion of many Russians. And we saw the protests, which I think were unanticipated by the regime, or at least they didn't anticipate their extent, which is why they didn't even bother with counter protests. And so because the initial response was so flat-footed, we've seen the crackdown coming even worse. The crackdown has been very bad. The last few independent media organizations have been shut down. And as in many other situations, repression abroad drives repression at home. We've seen that. And you know, I mentioned that economic stability has been the basis of Putin's legitimacy. And without that, what does he have? The bread and butter of all desperate autocrats, xenophobia, nationalism. So the public opinion will certainly be, he will be trying to shape it in his favor. I don't know how successful he will be because, at least from what I hear from people in Russia, they were shocked. People who were even, not even apolitical people, but people who were following this. And so I think, you know, there's going to be two competing elements here. One is the huge downturn in Putin's popularity stemming from the economic decline. And now there's a potential rise from the massive propaganda campaign that he is waging, and we'll have to see what outweighs the other. You know, it was already mentioned that the idea of cascades. Timur Kuran, in his study of 1989, you know, showed that these things either happen very suddenly or they just die out. And so if anything happens, we will see it soon, hopefully.
If I may just jump in to say that, yeah, I think the latest information is that around 6,000 Russians were arrested for anti-war protests, and then I think that that honestly, for any change to happen, for all these kinds of transformative revolutions, you need a defection from the center, and you need a protest on the streets. One, you know, and these two are watching each other carefully. I think that is the subtle interplay. What is significant is that Russians will try to disguise dead soldiers as much as they can, and it's a really disturbing fact, honestly. I think Belarus is now the graveyard of Russian soldiers. Ukrainian media reports that there are some mobile crematoriums on the ground. Apologies for this kind of evening session, but this is what is happening in Ukraine. And I think Ukrainians are doing something, if I can say wise, letting Russian prisoners of war call their mothers and explain where they are, what they are, you know, that they are basically captured by Ukrainian army, because families didn't know. Soldiers were not sure where they're going. They were not giving any direct instructions. And they just were scattered around Ukrainian villages. So they are calling their parents, explaining them where they are.
I have to say, I think we're talking ourselves almost into a touch of optimism, which is probably unjustified, because, I mean, you're absolutely right about the cascades, and these things can happen and they're unpredictable and no one knows when they come, and everybody was wise afterwards. But we have to say this is still quite unlikely, given the scale of repression in Russia at the moment and the Putin regime. So, I mean, I really want to ask the question, what happens in a situation which I'm afraid to say is likely, when neither side can win this war? right? So it's absolutely clear that Russia cannot win because the Ukrainian resistance will win, it will continue even after conventional military defeat. It's absolutely clear. There will be guerrilla warfare, there'll be massive civil resistance. They can't occupy it, puppet government, and fine. On the other hand, it's also equally clear that Ukraine cannot win against the overwhelming force superiority of the Russian military and its readiness to be ruthless, just to bombard and besiege. So we have a situation where neither side can win. If that is the case, then at some point there has to be a negotiation. And I wonder if we could spend a moment on what, it's no longer the off-ramp, Orysia. It's not the off-ramp for Putin. We're way beyond that, but it's a ghastly negotiation where you have to sit down with the representatives of a war criminal to end a war, as happened in former Yugoslavia. Now, Zelensky has talked about neutrality, hasn't he? Orysia, correct me if I'm wrong, but he has talked about neutrality. So that seems to be something he could potentially offer for a period. I'm working very hard to try and get the EU to open the offer of full candidate status for EU membership, because at least that offers something really significant to the Ukrainian people who fought and suffered and died, which is, you know, you are actually a candidate for EU membership. If you like to put it absolutely crudely, it's NATO goes on the back burner, but for that EU comes on the front burner. My question to everyone on the panel is that at all a credible landing ground, or is it simply no longer acceptable to Putin? Could Putin no longer sell that to whoever he has to sell it to back in Russia? Does he need recognition of Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk oblasts, or whatever else, full demilitarization? Because I think we need to have the conversation about where that landing zone that ends the war is.
On that, so if you claim, I guess that, and a lot of people have, that Putin can't, you know, like the end result of this is Putin takes over Ukraine, he sets up a puppet government, he either has to have stationed troops to like maintain that, because it's always going to be like, there's always going to be attempts to take that down if it's, you know, gotten by force. Then you end up having two situations, one being either that Putin hasn't thought this out very well or his government hasn't, which seems unlikely, or the second one is that there's like a different outcome that they're looking for here, in which case, is there anyone who could potentially speak to what, I guess, the overarching aim here was for our viewers, if possible?
If I may just come back to what Professor Ash was saying about what would be acceptable, what you know, in a way, I don't know what would be acceptable to Putin. Maybe Seva can talk about it. I'll say that if there is an offer of EU membership, this is something that Zelensky could put to Ukrainian nation. I mean, let's remember, there's nothing that divided Ukraine before this war. Zelensky is not a servant of the people anymore. He's the leader of the nation, to put it simply. So he has a backing, and he has to use it wisely, because he really has 90% trust him now. That is huge. But of course, the combat spirit of the population is also so far very high, like 80% say they believe in Ukraine's victory, right? I mean, just to understand the perspective, I think what Professor Ash is saying that, I mean, again, what we mean by that neutrality, I think what we are seeing now is emerging a certain pro-Ukrainian coalition that includes countries that are working in concert with Ukraine. I honestly don't even want to talk about NATO in Ukraine. That is irrelevant. What we're seeing right now, about 13 nation states helping Ukraine defend itself. What will emerge from that coalition of time of war could be some new institution for whatever Eastern Europe, or that would perhaps fill in the missing puzzle for countries like Ukraine. I don't know, but I think this scenario that you've described is something could be viable.
Can I pop in here, Monia? I think that, first of all, with regard to EU membership, I think the Russians made pretty clear in 2014 that any move towards EU membership was anathema. Maybe they will change. This gets me to my broader point. I think there is in the conflict resolution literature a strain of analysis on ripeness for settlement. That's to say, is this ripe to be negotiated successfully? I would say no. I would say no, because I think that Mr. Putin and his colleagues have to experience more pain. We are in very early days now. Give it a month or two with sanctions, and as he sees the consolidation of NATO and increasing defense spending and increasing cooperation within the alliance, he sees the consolidation for the first time of an EU foreign and security policy, which is was a surprise to me, but you never know, needs must. And I think the other issue is who can bear more pain? The Ukrainian side or the Russian side? I expect, and this is a very unpleasant topic of conversation, but I expect that the Ukrainians can bear more pain than the Russians can. So in a way, in the midterm, I'm reasonably optimistic that some kind of compromise can be cobbled together. The more people get killed, you could say the harder it will be. On the other hand, you could say the easier it might be.
But Neil, what's the compromise? Even if we accept your very depressing analysis that we have to go through more rivers of blood to get there.
This is a very good question, Timothy. I think neutrality is a possibility. Neutrality without EU membership, because you have to remember one of the perspectives that the Russians have about EU membership is that it diverts Ukraine from its historically determined path of membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. Sorry, that's how they would put it. And so I think neutrality is fine. I mean, well, it is a possibility. I do not know whether Putin would take that as enough. It depends how many hits he's taking on the ground and how unstable his position is in Moscow. But as who was it? It was Sun Tzu who said, "Give your adversary a golden bridge, so that they can get out of where they're at." As conditions change and as things become worse in Russia, the neutrality option might be more attractive to Putin than it is now.
Frankly, neutrality without EU membership is defeat for Ukraine. That is defeat. There is no big win for all that suffering. So maybe an acceptable landing ground for Putin and Russia, but I can't see how it's acceptable to Ukraine.
Well, the question is, if you're trading neutrality and if you're trading neutrality for non-occupation and for the end of violence against your own citizens, and if that's the deal, then it might be acceptable. I have no idea. You know more about Ukraine than I do, Tim. But I don't think EU membership or EU candidacy, I guess, could be part of a successful deal.
I mean, can we be clear about EU candidacy mean? It means 10 to 15 years. We're not
Well, this is true.
I mean, the Western Balkans, we know that. But what it does is it gives you a framework in which you consolidate your democracy and consolidate your legal system, consolidate your economic system. That's what it does. And the question is, I mean, there the West really does come in. if the West is then at that point capable of saying, either we're really going to screw you harder, and we're developing our energy independence so that actually your energy is going down, or you accept that deal. Well, I think it's at least worth a try.
Sorry, again, my apologies. I think we're just a bit new to using Zoom for panels, so this was really unexpected for us. We're so sorry. It should be solved by now.
Don't worry at all. Clearly the Wagner group was at work in the background. Now,
this is what every American professor went through about a year and a half ago.
Absolutely.
So don't worry about it.
Yeah. You're not on mute. So just to finish the thought, clearly stability for Xi Jinping over the next year until he's confirmed in office for his next term, and therefore potentially forever more. But on the other hand, in many ways, China is sitting pretty, because it could be a great beneficiary of this. More energy will eventually flow from Russia to China. Russia will become more dependent on China as it's isolated by the West. The entire West will be so distracted by Russia and the threat to Europe that the famous pivot to Asia, which Obama started trying in 2008 and Biden started trying just again, will again be frustrated. So even if Xi Jinping doesn't think I'm going to use the opportunity to have a go at Taiwan, I think China could potentially be a great beneficiary.
Fonny, do you mind if I add a little bit?
Please jump in.
Yeah, so I think I don't want to say too much about China, because I think that's been covered really well. I want to talk a little bit about beyond Russia and Ukraine, the potential for unrest in the region, because that hasn't been covered yet. You know, the former Soviet space, and I'm very sorry to call it that because that term is now again relevant, is very linked, and disturbances spread. To give you just one example, Central Asia relies very heavily on Russian remittances. And now we have all these young unemployed men coming home with no prospects. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan recently just had a lot of unrest. So all of this will make the situation harder. And even beyond the immediate region, the effects of things like food prices. You know, in 2010, Russia had those massive wildfires. People probably forgot. It burned about a third of global wheat, and you know, it raised food prices so much that it directly contributed to the Arab Spring, creating unrest over food prices, obviously one of the many factors. So, you know, this risks doing the same thing, not just in the immediate Russian region, but around the world. And so it would be ironic if Putin's attempt to squash revolutions produced another wave of them. It would also be sad because, you know, we love our color revolutions from afar, but the results are often mixed. And in the current context, they're much more likely to result in autocratic retrenchment than any kind of democratic flowering. So we may be finding out, you know, that unipolarity is, you know, the worst order except for all the others. And hopefully that will not be the case, but it will be a very, very difficult time for the region.
And not only for the region.
Well, we've talked a lot, I guess, about politics and geopolitics, and I'd just like to take just one question to kind of discuss a bit, kind of the lived experience of what's going on. I was wondering, like, you know, since we've had so many people like fleeing Ukraine, we've already kind of seen that European countries have indicated that they're a lot more sympathetic to European refugees than they were in 2015 to those from Syria and the Middle East. I was wondering what you think is going to happen with these people comes next. And whether we could just, like, you know, talk about this for a bit before we start taking a few questions from the audience members. That's all right.
If I may take that as a sort of Europeanist, I mean, the transformation in Poland and Hungary has been absolutely extraordinary. The countries that would not take a single refugee in solidarity with South European countries in the 2015 refugee crisis, now opening their arms to hundreds of thousands. And there's an obvious irony in this, because it just so happens these are white Christian Europeans, and that may have something to do with the Willkommenskultur that we're now seeing, the welcoming culture. I think there's an opportunity there for other European countries, EU member states, to show the solidarity that the Central and East Europeans failed to show to them in 2015, to show that they mean it. But I have to say the long-term impact, if the refugee flows are as large as predicted, so the projections now are 4 to 7 million. 4 to 7 million Ukrainian refugees. That is the largest refugee inflow in Europe since the 1940s, since the great movements of people at the end of the Second World War. And what the long-term impact on that is on European societies remains to be seen, because even where there was a welcome culture for refugees from the Syrian civil war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that only lasted so long. So I think it's a huge challenge.
I may just add a few words, because we were on the call with the Refugee Council here in the UK, and also I'm in touch with organizations inside Ukraine. So immediately what is related to receiving side in the European Union, of course, there's accumulation of people on the eastern borders, like in the eastern part of EU. But what we are seeing is basically elderly grandmothers and grandchildren fleeing, or mothers and children. Men are not allowed to flee. I mean, men are militarily conscripted between the ages of 18 to 60. So you see quite heartbreaking images of families being split, where men take their women by cars to the border. And there's an immediate urgency to assure safe passage and accompanied passage, because there are also groups of young adults, teenagers, who are living without their parents because parents are staying behind. Because of that resolve to fight that I was telling you before, this is the kind of vulnerable migration that we are seeing. And I am personally quite disgraced by the position of the UK on the visa waiver and other measures. We do know that Ukrainians have biometric passports. They can go in the EU without a visa in peaceful time. At the time of humanitarian crisis like that, I think we have to put all the possible effort to make sure we are able to receive people. And let's be honest, there will not be so many of them coming to the UK. And those that will be coming to the UK have families here, have Ukrainian community here to help. So if you can, from where you are, support, you know, there's a petition of visa waiver that received 100,000 signatures in, I believe, 2 days. But we have to, as always, we are not prepared in terms of infrastructure to accommodate, train people. We always taken aback. And then I think the situation inside Ukraine is even more critical. I have friends from East Europe Foundation who are working with IDPs, because remember, most inflow so far is internal, it's not external. People are fleeing to the western part of Ukraine. My hometown, Lviv, is swollen with people. My family hosts, I don't know, 5 different people. 2 of them are small children without parents. And this is what is going to happen. From there will be influx towards EU, because of these statements we made at the beginning that Putin is after whole of Ukraine. It's just a matter of time when this arrives to western border. So we have to seriously consider all these implications.
And on that, I'll take 2 quick questions from the audience, and then we can hopefully wrap this up, potentially maybe only around 5 minutes late. So the first question was, it was mentioned that Putin's 20 years of legitimization has been collapsing. Does this relate to the weakening of Putin's tactic of using the past in politics to overshadow the decisions of the present? How do you see the long-term political trajectory of such a collapse? And potentially we could hear from Professor Gunitsky on this.
Great, sure. Can you repeat the first question? I think I cut out for a second.
My bad. It's referring to Putin's 20 years of legitimization that's been collapsing. Does this relate to the weakening of Putin's tactic of using the past in politics to overshadow the decisions of the present? And hopefully that makes sense.
I'm not sure what that means exactly. The tactic of using the past is something that pretty much every politician does to some extent, but it's true that, for example, Putin is not a pro-Soviet politician. I think we can reject that. He rejected the Soviet Union in his war declaration and in fact spent some time critiquing Lenin. So he's selective about his history. I think the history he's really looking back to is Russian imperial history, untied to Soviet dogma, which he, I think, holds in contempt in some ways, because he had seen its failure. So in terms of the long-term trajectory, you know, this is unsustainable, but as my Israeli friends have been saying for decades, situation continues to be unsustainable, right? So we'll see how long it actually lasts. He's been in power for 20 years. You know, this is when the pathologies that I talked about really start to come out, and perhaps we're seeing that. So I can't even begin to speculate about the next few years.
And the second question that we've received is, can Russia and China and other rogue countries like Myanmar, Belarus, Iran create a parallel financial transfer system, digital yuan as reserve currency, etc.? I'm not sure if that makes sense, but.
Well, I mean, both Russia and China now have remote payment systems in place, which are supposedly international. The question would be, what good does that do, really? It's great for managing Sino-Russian trade, but not so good for Moscow trading with Illinois, say, or because it's not transferable.
And in the chat, another final question, since we have like 3 minutes to spare and we're going through these quite fast, is, among the US, Europe, Russia, and China, who does the panel think will emerge stronger from the conflict and who will emerge weaker?
China. Stronger.
Now, could you repeat the question and I will take a stab at it?
Yes, sorry. Among the countries, among the US, Europe, Russia, and China, who does the panel think will emerge stronger from this conflict and who will come out of it weaker?
I should say that Europe is an aspirant country. It is not yet a country.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just
leaving that aside. I think my sense is that Europe will get stronger as a result of this. China will, as for reasons that Timothy explained earlier, probably get stronger from this. The United States, I don't think this will have a significant impact on America's position in world affairs. I mean, it has its own dynamic, which is largely a domestic dynamic. So that would be what I would have to say about that.
I think China will get stronger. I think that's a clear potential beneficiary. On Europe, it all depends how Europe responds to this challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with Professor Garton. I think if Ukraine falls, both Europe and US will be weaker because of the whatever is left of soft power, preaching about democracy in the world, defending democracy, Biden doctrine of autocracies versus democracies. That will be a very strong crack in that doctrine. And I believe personally that Russia will emerge much weaker with the possible disintegration in the national states.
Thank you. Professor Gunitsky?
I'll just say very, very quickly, you know, the one possibility here is, you know, if this is something that strengthens the US position, it could help Biden win the re-election. And if nothing else, if the US stance on this helps Biden win and prevents Trump from taking office, I think that will strengthen the US significantly in the future. But this is obviously pure speculation, but it's something to consider, the domestic consequences for Biden. And so I'll stop there.
And one final comment, in terms of short-term effects, it's hard to say because this war is going to go on for a long time.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for our incredible panelists, Professor Gunitsky, Professor MacFarlane, Ms. Lutsevych, and Professor Garton. Thank you so much. And this should be going up on our YouTube as well soon, so that'll be sent to everyone. Have an amazing day. Thank you so much.